As Pastor John was noting during the lighting of the Christ candle, and we're all aware, we human beings are so often divided. Nations competing for resources, putting sanctions on one another to create pressure, going to war, fighting to defend, fighting to conquer. And then in our own nation, for many of us in our own lifetimes, we feel more divided than ever. That people can't seem to agree on anything, or that if there's a different perspective, someone yells back, well, that's fake news, or that's false information. And so it's so hard to even trust where people are coming from, and then to trust one another. And all of this, I think, is highlighted in the midst of crisis. I mean, if things are kind of smooth and there's divisions, well, maybe you don't notice the roughness of those cracks. But in a global pandemic, in calls for racial justice, in trauma and drama and fires, we are more aware of how the divisions hurt us. How do we move through a pandemic together, where we say we're all in it together, but we're not? Why are human beings like this? At one point I was going to share some of the sociological and evolutionary biology research that people do to talk about why, but you can go do your own research about that. You don't need a pastor to tell you those things. But I do want to talk about what I might call the psycho-spiritual dynamics behind division, and I'll start by my own confession. I'm remembering this one time where I woke up with a lot on my mind. Of course, that's every day in 2020. But I'm remembering in particular a time a number of years ago, and why it stands out was my response to a lot of things on my mind. So there had been a controversy and emails flying back and forth, tinged with emotional content. And I think we all know that's the worst. When people are trying to talk about something important with emotional content and then are just emailing each other, misunderstanding each other, and all that kind of thing. So I woke up first thing in the morning and I had this thought about the email that I could write in response to another email. Now normally, what I would do in my commitment on a typical morning is there's some coffee, which my coffee pot has brewed ahead of time, so I don't have to concentrate on that in the morning. And then I have a Bible, some sort of devotional material, and I have some readings in that. I have a prayer journal, and I write my prayers, joys, concerns, prayers for other people, what are my worries, what am I struggling with, what are my questions, and then I leave time for listening. We say God's still speaking. If we don't listen, it doesn't matter. So I practice listening, silence and meditation. So that's my commitment to how to begin the day. Yet that day, I thought, well, I'll just respond to the email first because it's on my mind, and then I'll go do that God stuff. So I open up my laptop and then open up my emails, and there's 7 more emails. And I read those emails, and I start writing to some of those, and then I start trying to compose my brilliant email that will help everyone see the light, or whatever it is I think I'm doing. And by the time I finish all that and close down my laptop, I'm completely out of time. I need to head out into the day, I have a meeting, and I am fragmented and stressed out. My heart rate's accelerated, and the only thing going on in me is caffeine. And I remember that was a rough day, because I was pulled in lots of different directions, and so as I engaged meetings and appointments and engaged with other people, I was not centered, I was not whole, I was not put together, so to speak. I was fragmented, and so there's little shards of me that, whether I meant to or not, poke and cut in my interactions and relationships. I was living that day with what the psalmist would call, from Psalm 86 that you heard, a divided heart. I was, instead of centered and whole, I was fragmented and in a million different directions, and so the way I lived was fragmenting and in lots of different directions. And I think that happens for a lot of us a lot of the time, no matter what part of life that we're in. Even people who self-identify as Christians, we say, I've decided to follow Jesus. And Jesus says, all right, seek first the reign of God and right relationship with God, and love God with your heart, mind, soul, and strength so you can love your neighbor as yourself. And we say, okay, but first I'm going to take care of these things. First, I'm going to attend to this, or I've got these chores or these duties, or I'm going to watch CNN or check my Facebook feed, or whatever it is that we do first. And then often that God stuff gets put to the margins. And what we've done usually in a typical day is we've been pulled in all kinds of different directions. And so whether we know it or not, we're living with divided hearts. We're fragmented. There's a brokenness, which then creates these sharp edges. And whether we mean to live it or not, then we tend to cut or bump or push others, and that creates fragmenting. It's like, have you ever had a rock hit your windshield? And it starts with that little crack, and then it just starts to spread out? Well, we become like the little rocks in the windshield. Boom! And it's our own little crack, but it spreads out into the world. So I really appreciate Psalm 86, where the psalmist recognizes what's happening. And it seems he's recognizing what's happening because he's in crisis. And, if things are humming along, well, fragmented or not, we seem okay, so we don't pay attention too much to it. But when things are falling apart, when the world feels like it's on fire, then we might say, well, maybe something's not working. So the psalmist, his world's on fire. Things are breaking up all over. And so he recognizes, well, first I need help. And so he brings this to God, which is a really good thing to do. And part of the prayer, the key line for me in the prayer, the psalm, the song, is he says, give me an undivided heart, that I would revere your name. And I need to say something about revere your name, because we might hear that all kinds of different ways. The name of someone, the name of God in Hebrew way of thinking isn't just a magic word. It's just not like Bill or Bob. The name of someone is their whole essence, their being, their way of living. So the psalmist is saying, let me have an undivided heart so I can live your way in the world, so I can embody you in the world. And it's not a quick perfunctory prayer. It's not a, hey, God, just help me get it together and off I go. There's some lingering here. There's some self-awareness that comes with this praying. It's like a self-examination, a prayer of examine. Some of you have heard of that. It's that kind of prayer in this psalm that we're seeing, where he's naming first, here's my trouble, this isn't working, and I feel afraid and up to my neck, and I'm drowning in my own tears. So he names those things. This is hard. And then he also, though, names and recognizes, God, you've done good things. You've helped in the past. You've helped other people. And that helps him know that God's a good one to go to with all of this. And one of my favorite parts of the psalm is when he says, essentially, by the way, if I'm dead, who's going to do your work? And this is not to convince a reluctant God to wake up and pay attention to the psalmist. Some people hear it that way, but that's not what prayer is. It's not like God was like inattentive, and because the psalmist said all those words, God's now like, oh, I'm sorry, what? Let me help you. It's really to get the psalmist connected with God. He becomes aware of the crisis, the problem, the trouble. He's remembering God's goodness. He knows that he has purpose to live God's way in the world, and what he yearns for is to be united instead of divided within himself. And so the very process of the prayer is bringing him together. It allows, you've heard the line, the cracks are where the light gets in. So he sees his cracks, and then he invites the light in, and there's healing and unity in him. And then he can live that in the world. Not fragmented, not fractured, not divided. He lives then in ways, has the power to bring wholeness and healing and unity into relationships and systems, to live God's way in the world. And Jesus, well, that's what he does. Jesus lives with an undivided heart. And that's why we're still talking about him 2,000 years later. It also points out how rare it is that people live with undivided hearts. But Jesus did. And it didn't come somehow naturally or magically. He did, like to use the language from last week, he did his work. He did that internal work, the daily practices, the things that helped him to be integrated with God and his true self, so that he could live that integration, that wholeness, that healing in the world. Early in the morning prayer, all night prayer, breaking bread together with his friends, talking about the stories, wrestling with what really matters. And all of that is about living united with God and our true selves and our purpose, which then empowers him by God's Spirit and life at work in him to live it in the world. And Jesus didn't do it, like we've said many times, to impress people so that people would say, yay, Jesus, or let's worship Jesus. That Jesus does it to say, you come follow me and do it too. Seek first the reign of God and right relationship with God. and the other things take the right place. Now, Jesus, though, he says those things, but he knows it's not easy. I mean, he's a human being, person living in the world, and knows all the different directions we can get pulled in. And that's why we have this challenging and seemingly contradictory passage today in the gospel, which, by the way, these passages often land on Mother's Day or Father's Day. What's up with that? But nonetheless, there it is. So where Jesus says, I didn't come to bring unity, and then father against mother, against brother-in-law, etc. But that's not about that Jesus came to break people apart, but he's coming to help people let go of the things that are in the way so they can live with integrity and wholeness, and then live the best possible ways in the world. And he focuses on family because that's the key component, the most likely thing that people in his time and place would seek before they went seeking God. Because family was everything. I mean, people now will say things like, my family's everything, and we mean that more emotionally. Well, in that time and place, there were the emotions and the feelings, but your family was your 401k and your retirement and your nursing home. And I mean, it was really literally everything. It was the unit of survival. And so the temptation, the draw would be to focus first on your family, to make sure they're surviving or they're fed or they're, and I'm not saying that their survival doesn't matter, but what we tend to do is, well, just focus first on the tasks and the things and then get around to God. And Jesus says, no, because then you're attending to your family out of your own fragmented, divided heart. And then you're living, whether you mean to or not, in fragmentation and division. And so Jesus calls people to first be in and with God and united with their true selves, to have undivided hearts. And with undivided hearts, attend to your family, attend to the other things. So there's this strong language where he says, hate your family. Now, some of us already say, got that covered, because it can be hard, some families. But most of us are bristling at that, especially on Father's Day. So, and I'm not trying to explain it away, but the Greek word here, we don't have a good English equivalent. So our English word, hate, is tinged with lots of emotion. I mean, I hear people, I hate this. And we mean like, I want to smack or smash or destroy. The word that's here doesn't mean that. It means, we might call a vigorous letting go. More along the lines of, I hate Brussels sprouts, and you push the plate away. It's that idea, where Jesus knows that people are so enmeshed and attached to taking care of family first. He says, first you got to push the plate away. And not because you're done with your family, but so you make room to let the Spirit be at work in you. And then with wholeness and integrity, you attend to your family. You attend to the other elements of life, that then the rings of life that go out from that. I mean, I would say it applies to if we're concerned about racial reconciliation, but we're fragmented in ourselves, we're not going to do much good around racial reconciliation. And so Jesus calls us to the practices that help us have first undivided hearts. And wholeness in ourselves can bring wholeness in our relationships, and then we can work and more clearly engage in ways that bring wholeness to systems and governmental operations and all the rest of life. But if we're fragmented, if we are cracked and just broken and running around with our broken pieces, poking others, we don't do and live the good we want to do and live. I was remembering this time where a father and teenage daughter came to meet with me. They'd set up this appointment. And the father explained that, so the mother, the wife, had left a couple years before. This father was single parenting a teenage daughter, and there was a lot of conflict and struggle. And he had sought to get some counseling. The daughter's like, I'm not going to go talk to a stranger. And so I was the backup plan, so to speak. She trusted me. She had known me, and was willing to have me be at least the first line of conversation with them together. So they came in, and the dad presented the deep challenge he was in, that he's trying to do it all on his own, and that work is incredibly stressful, and he doesn't understand why his daughter can't see that he's working so hard to take care of her so she'll have a good future, and all she does is talk back and rebel, and why can't she just obey? Well, any of you who've ever worked with teenagers know where that's going. But the daughter, actually, I will say, she heard her dad. She heard her dad. She understood. And she acknowledged that she didn't make it easier. But then what she said, I think, completely surprised the father. She said, but Dad, you're always just so angry all the time. And even sometimes mean-spirited, and you didn't used to be that way. And Dad, all the things that I think helped you be you stopped doing. You don't go running anymore. You don't go to your yoga class or that Bible study. You hardly ever hang out with your friends. And you used to every morning, and I knew not to bother you, you would have that prayer and meditation time. And part of why I know about that is Mom would say, leave your dad alone. And I also knew that right after you prayed and meditated, that's when I should ask you for stuff. Not because you always said yes, but because even then, even if you had to say no, you said it kindly. But you stopped all that stuff, and you're just snapping and snarling and impatient. And the father heard his daughter, and it sunk in. And so essentially we started talking about his pulled in all those directions, working so hard to try to take care of his daughter and his job, that he was actually fragmented in himself and fragmenting the relationship. Give me an undivided heart that I can live your way in the world. This is an invitation, maybe a challenge for you. Let that be your prayer this week. And not just perfunctory, quick, all right, God, give me an undivided heart, and then I'm going to go on to the next thing. But like the psalmist is modeling, like we see Jesus do, spend some time each day aware of what's creating tension and hardship, aware of your response to it, remembering the ways that you've seen and known or heard that God can be at work, and that you engage that practice and process that helps you to have the undivided heart so that you can live with integrity and bring more integrity into relationships in the world. I just think about this. As people in great pain are crying out, Black Lives Matter. And they're doing that and saying that because for over 400 years there's been lots of evidence that the majority doesn't believe that's true. That Black lives seem expendable. And yet then there are people who respond back and say, well, all lives matter, because somehow they think they're not being included or they feel defensive. And I think about how would those conversations be different if the people who are involved were living with undivided hearts. But it's our defensiveness and fragmentation in us that just keeps the waves of conflict crashing back and forth. Or I hear the stories of a woman in a grocery store with her mask on who sees someone without it and just shames that person. Or another story where another person without a mask sees someone with a mask, calls them a snowflake, and spits on them. What would be different if those people had been centered in the Spirit and were living with undivided hearts? That's why this matters. Because it's not just about what's good for us. Jesus teaches that because it's what's then good for the world. And we need it. Jesus shows us the way. Come and see.